Cast. We're going to give folks a little bit more time to log on here. So just hold tight a minute or two before we get started. All right, I'm going to fire it up. This is an important topic. I know some folks are still showing up, but plenty to cover here. Welcome to the webcast from Strada's Education Network, Public Viewpoint. New findings today on back to class. Will pandemic-disrupted learners return to school? I'm Paul Fain. I'm your moderator. I'm a journalist who writes a newsletter called The Job on this topic and better connections between education and work, which I think is one of the biggest challenges our nation faces right now. My newsletter will be joined soon by a sister publication that's kicking off next month called Work Shift. And I'm just going to give you a couple data points to reinforce the point of how important this topic is. I think everybody probably on this call knows well higher education's enrollment crisis. Following the last fall's declines, particularly in the community college sector, which was about 10% overall, this spring we saw an 11% decline in the community college sector. And this follows basically a multi-year shift of folks increasingly questioning the value of a college credential, which I must add remains the best ticket to the middle class, assuming you complete and don't take on too much debt. But this is not just a problem for higher education, it's one for employers and society on the whole. The AP today reported that US job openings rose 8% in March, but overall hiring rose less than 4%. We could spend the whole hour arguing about labor shortages and whether they exist or not. But I'll just say there's an increasing body of information showing that people are questioning their careers. They're rethinking what they want to do and how to get there. And that's part of what we're here to talk about. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists before turning over to Andrew Hanson from Strada to talk about the findings. First, Dr. Sujin Gatlin-Jez, the Executive Director of California Competes. California Competes is a nonprofit policy organization that seeks to increase access to college and improve college graduation rates. Created in 2011 by civic and business leaders in California, the group calls for better coordination and planning for the future needs of the state's economy, which, as you may have heard, is a large economy. And then next, Dr. Linda Garcia, Executive Director of the Center for Community College Student Engagement at the University of Texas at Austin, Texas, also a big economy. The center is a service and research initiative at UT Austin's College of Education. It provides information about effective educational practices in community colleges and assists institutions and policymakers in using information to promote improvements in student learning, persistence, attainment, and let's say engagement as well, which is the topic of the day. But first, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to tell us about the numbers.
Thanks, Paul. And on behalf of Strada, just welcome and thank you all for joining us today. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Public Viewpoint, aside from this webinar series, is a nationally representative survey of 1,000 adults that we've been conducting since the onset of the pandemic. At first, every week, and then every 2 weeks, and now on a monthly basis. And so our goal with the Public Viewpoint is just to better understand workers and learners' preferences, perspectives, and experiences with respect to education, training, and work as we all navigate the pandemic. And so Paul talked a lot about this, but we all know the incredibly disruptive effect that the pandemic's had on work and education, record levels of unemployment, the declining enrollment numbers that Paul talked about, especially with respect to first-time students, the community college sector. Our most recent data that Paul referred to on job openings, there are 8.6 million job openings, which is a record high. Before the pandemic, we had 7 million, just by comparison. So far, a lot of those job openings aren't being filled. The reasons for that are complex, and I just have to say, Paul's done a terrific job kind of reporting and capturing some of the dynamics at play there. So we encourage you to subscribe to the job. At the same time, the more enrollment data that come in just suggests that things are even worse than we imagined, and there's obviously a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen this fall. So where we come in is, a year ago, we reported early on in the spring the extent and the nature of the disruption, both to work and education. And we saw how widespread that was. And so what we've done today is updated that analysis to reflect all of the disruption that's taken place over the past year, in the past 10 months or so, and then added a little bit of detail there. Just a friendly reminder as I go through these, that they are available to download if you want to follow along on your own, take notes and so on. My colleague, Carrie Sampson, is going to post the links in the chat. And we also have details on our data source and methods at the back end of the deck if you're interested in that. So with that, let's go ahead and dig in. So the first thing we asked about was changes at work that resulted from the pandemic. And to date, we saw that half of adults said their work had changed in some way as a result of the pandemic. And the most common changes were having to work either more or fewer hours, a change in the amount that someone had to work. But a lot of folks also said that they lost their job. That was common, or that they had to start a new job because of the pandemic. So we have seen job change. And then with respect to education, we asked whether folks had to change or cancel their education plans because of the pandemic. And we had 37% of adults who said yes, 15% who said they canceled their plans altogether, 22% who said that they changed them in some way. The most common experiences that you can see on the right there are canceling your plans altogether or delaying when you were going to enroll, they plan to enroll, but then the pandemic caused them to put that off. Other common changes we saw were reducing the amount of coursework you're taking on, or switching to an online modality or an online provider. Compared to when we reported on this in May of last year, we've seen a slight uptick in the overall levels, but the vast majority of the disruption took place in those first few months of the pandemic. Among learners, which are people who reported that they had some kind of education plan, young adults were a lot more likely to have had their education disrupted than working age adults. And then Latinos and Asian Americans experienced the greatest disruption among racial groups. But of course, we also learned last year that, if you look at disruption broadly in total, work, education, life, health, and so on, that Black Americans experience some of the greatest concentrations of disruptions, as well as women, millennials, leisure hospitality workers. So the suffering has been quite widespread. We also asked disrupted learners about their reasons, their motivations for changing or canceling their plans, and there was quite a bit of diversity here. The most common reasons were financial costs and competing work demands, which, as we all know, were exacerbated by the pandemic. We also had a lot of folks who said either they could not or didn't want to attend in person, that they had caregiving responsibilities, or that they just had health concerns that were related to the pandemic. So that's where we're at currently in terms of the extent, the magnitude of the disruption. And in the second part of this analysis, we wanted to check in on these disrupted workers and learners and get a sense of specifically the extent to which they're pursuing education and training. And so we saw that workers who said they experienced some kind of change, which I referred to earlier, are indeed turning to education and training to help them retool. In fact, they were more than 3 times more likely to say that they planned to enroll in an education or training program in the next 6 months, compared to those who said that they didn't experience a change at work. And so that's encouraging and that's good news. What was more disheartening, however, is what's happened to disrupted learners. And again, that's referring to those who had changed or canceled their plans because of the pandemic. That's what they said. So when we were first reported on these learners in the spring of last year, 9 out of 10 said either that they were still enrolled or that they had planned to enroll in an education or training program in the next 6 months. And as you can see here, both enrollment and intentions to enroll for this group of disrupted learners have both declined substantially. And so you think about what that means for all of the individuals and the families, what that represents. And it's really, in our view, a national crisis of folks who were pursuing education and training, but appear to have given up that pursuit. They're no longer on the path to all of the benefits that we associate with education, upward mobility, career advancements, realizing your potential and achieving your goals. And so that's why we're here today. This diversion from education and training has been really concentrated among working age adult learners in particular. So you see only 2% of working age adults who said their learning was disrupted say that they're currently enrolled in the moment, and only 34% of those folks plan to enroll in the next 6 months. By contrast, if you look over at young adults, 18 to 24-year-olds, more than 90% of those folks said that they're pursuing education in some form. Among racial groups, perhaps surprising to some, it's actually white disrupted learners who are the most the least likely to be in pursuit of education. And so even though that's of course widespread across racial groups, and that may be related to something that we've seen as we've been conducting this research over the past few years, which is that white Americans in general, Paul kind of referred to this, are becoming increasingly skeptical of the value proposition of education compared to folks of color. And so finally, we asked disrupted learners who intend to enroll in the next 6 months where they plan to enroll, meaning what kind of provider. And what we see overall here is that there's a much greater interest in the work-based and non-traditional education and training options, which are in green and at the top there, compared to the traditional options from colleges and universities, which are in blue. And that's something that we've seen more broadly as we've looked at these trends more broadly across the entire population in different groups. That's the same pattern that we've seen, but it's true for this population of disrupted learners as well. And we also saw that the 2 most popular options that you see at the top there were employers and online non-college training providers, which includes things like online courses, training, certifications. So something like a boot camp, would fall into that category. And that's interesting because I think the latter part is interesting. We've seen interest in employer-provided education and training since before the pandemic, and certainly we saw a growing interest in these online non-college training options. But those have accelerated quite a bit in the pandemic. So that's really interesting to see. So the reason all this matters, in my view, is that this recession, this crisis has been different. Recessions generally tend to accelerate the changes in the kinds of jobs that are available and the skills that are in demand. The jobs being created are different from the jobs that we lost. And one of the reasons that education and training is so important is that it helps workers adapt. It helps them retool, reskill, transition to the new opportunities where the jobs are coming. But in this case, the combination of the financial shocks that we saw, the competing family and caregiving responsibilities, and then the barriers to in-person learning those three together have inhibited so many of these workers and learners from pursuing the education and training that normally would help them adapt to the changes that are taking place. And what we're seeing is that so many of these learners are getting discouraged. They're giving up and abandoning their education plans. And so in the long run, I'm confident that they'll be able to adapt. But there's also a lot of short-term, sort of unnecessary suffering that we can minimize by finding ways to accelerate workers' ability to adapt and connecting them to learning and to the opportunities that are coming online in the labor market. And so as so many of us, I think, are now in this mode where we're reconnecting after hopefully, getting vaccinated and reconnecting with our families, with our friends, with our communities, reconnecting learners to education and to pathways to career and to life success is the first order challenge of the moment that we're in. And so the research that I've shared with you today and this webinar is part of a broader effort of Strada's this year. And that's an effort focused on reconnecting learners whose education was disrupted. And as I said, we believe this is a national crisis. We are committed to advancing our understanding of the nature of this disruption and identifying solutions as well. And that's why we're here. So we have, just real quickly before we jump into the panel, we've got a series of research projects that are connected to that endeavor. This spring, we convened education and workforce leaders from across the country, which includes heads of institutions, states, leading nonprofits, and we asked them how to reconnect specifically to the 2020 and 21 high school classes back to school. And so you can find the results of that survey on our website, and we'll post a link to the chat to that. And then we have an upcoming webinar next week that's focused on community colleges in particular, and how they can sort of reverse the decline in enrollment trends that they've experienced over the course of the pandemic. So just please stay tuned as we work to reconnect our nation's workers and learners to education and training. With that, thank you again for being here today, and thank you for the work that you do. And Paul, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate that. I really like the framing of the great reconnection. It's got some optimism embedded in there. So just a quick housekeeping thing. I'm going to leave some time at the end for your questions, but I'd love it if you ask them throughout, and we'll turn to questions as soon as I can. You can just put them in the Q&A, as I'm sure we all know now, at the bottom of our Zoom browser. And just from all the folks saying hello, it looks like a lot of practitioners out there. So great to have you, and we can hope this can be helpful. So, Andrew, you don't have to be a crack journalist to know that part of the news here is the declining intent to enroll in the survey. It's really alarming there. And let's start with Dr. Garcia. Can you talk about some of the barriers that you're seeing that might be preventing students from thinking about enrolling, particularly underrepresented students? Anything you want to really highlight that Andrew mentioned, or maybe even some causes you think aren't getting enough attention?
Absolutely. And let me just start off saying, Paul, thank you for the invitation to be part of the discussion, and kudos to your team and Andrew for presenting the data on this critical conversation that we have to continue having, because our students are experiencing this pandemic that's impacting their student success, and understanding what it is to look at the student holistically. It has raised that conversation, has amplified that conversation. What Andrew mentioned, those are things that we are seeing at the Center for Community College Student Engagement. In fact, we just released a report recently about how students are faring with the pandemic. What does that mean for their student experience? What you showed, we saw the same thing. In addition to that, we would include Native American students who are experiencing a lot of challenges. They also said about changes with their plans. Now, our report only looked at students who are currently enrolled, but yours took it a step further. They were disrupted, and why did they not, what were some of the things that impacted them? But just a little bit of nuggets that we learned. 1/3 of our students said their plans changed, just like you did. They changed in ways which they planned to attend another community college, or they planned to attend a university, but they decided to stay locally, or they decided to enroll at the college. They had no plans to enter whatsoever. So there were some adjustments that were made. But the barriers that you talked about, absolutely, community colleges, they serve the most students that are low income, minoritized populations, and those populations have been impacted by the pandemic. They're struggling to pay for college. Our data showed that 31% of Native American students struggled with this, 25% Black students, 20% Hispanic students. And just to let the audience know, this report represented 38 colleges, over 5,100 students. And so we heard from them. But what was also notable is that students with children, as you also mentioned, had struggles as well. How do you balance that when your child is there with you virtually and they're enrolled in their learning environment as you are too? The lack of connection to internet, the lack of having a computer was also a challenge to them. But I think a barrier that may need more attention, and I want to go back to that word that Andrew just said, reconnection. I really believe that there has to be more emphasis on connecting to those students, to those disrupted learners, but also connecting to students before they become a disrupted learner. In our data, we'll ask students if they feel welcomed at the college or if they have good relationships. Now, the great news is that the majority of students say yes, they agree, but there's always that small percentage of students who say no or they're neutral. So right now during this pandemic, it is so important to connect to those students to make sure that they know that the college is there to support them, that the student knows that the college cares for them. I'm reminded of a college, in fact, who was one of the Aspen, in fact, it was announced yesterday, Amarillo College, for example. They're one of the award recipients, and they talk about a culture of caring. So how does a college do that during this pandemic? And it's really about connection, listening to the student, getting to know their story, and customizing the services for them so they can move forward. Because we know that students come to the college to succeed. They don't come to us to fail. But along the way, they're going to need some type of guidance to get to the finish line.
Thanks for that, Linda. You really can't say enough about the child care and the culture of caring pieces from all the data we've seen. Let's turn to Dr. Gatlin. Jez, any barriers that you are particularly interested in California or beyond, or ones that you think might not be getting enough attention?
Yes, and thank you also for having me, and I really appreciate Strada and Paul, your focus on the role of higher education in the economy and jobs, and bringing more attention to students that aren't the traditional straight from high school college students. And it took a pandemic, I think, to make a lot of people pay attention to this, but I'm happy that we can seize the moment and hopefully get some traction on some changes. And like Dr. Garcia was saying, I think we can point to a lot of the personal and practical reasons students may leave higher education or may not want to return, like family responsibilities, the need to work, as you found. And I think at the key is really restructuring our higher ed institutions to support students at completion and focusing less on sort of what can the institution do to meet students where they are. We know a lot of things about this recession already. We have a good sense of what things are going to look like, perhaps when we get out of it, that folks without college degrees were in industries that were heavily impacted. After this pandemic, a lot of these jobs may not come back. They'll look a lot different. Higher ed has a major role in what our recovery looks like. And so we need to figure out what needs to happen. We've done a lot of, California Competes has done a lot of work on what do adult students need? How does higher ed better serve older students, particularly displaced workers? Like you found, affordability is a primary barrier. It's often discussed, but the nuances for adults often receive a lot less attention. And California is known for its robust state financial aid program, but it's much harder for adults to get financial aid in California. Our Cal Grants, which is our state financial aid program, mostly go to younger students. It's they're restricted to recent high school graduates and students younger than 28, which effectively shuts out older students and those that would be impacted by the economy in the middle of this. So ending those limits, those eligibility requirements would be a significant support for students. We also know that these potential graduates are more likely to be people of color, and this past year has made it painfully clear the challenges that Black and Latinx and Asian Americans face, in discrimination in everyday lives. And I think higher ed institutions have acknowledged this and released statements around this. I think a lot more could be done by institutions to look at their own policies and practices and how that discrimination and racism and violence extends into their own institutions. Because it can be, just hard to wake up in the morning and face the day and to think that you're going to balance everything else out and go to school. And I'm confident that this extends to Native American, but the data can be so limited for that population. But I just want to recognize when we do have data on Native Americans, we need to, I think, spend a lot more time focusing on sort of how we can focus resources and think about how racism impacts this population also. I think Dr. Garcia mentioned broadband and internet access. This is a huge one. I'm glad it's getting so much attention now. And another thing related to that is digital literacy. I think doesn't get enough attention. Because of the pandemic, so much went online, including nearly all of higher ed. And a lot of it is going to stay online, and not just higher ed, but telehealth or grocery shopping or whatever else. And those without college degrees have much lower rates of digital literacy than those with college degrees. So we need to think about also what's our role in ensuring that when we shift to online, that we're not exacerbating inequities that already existed.
Thanks for that. I also appreciate where you started with the fact that a lot of these inequities were here before, and it took the pandemic to get people to notice, while also, worsening them. To take a step back, though, as we look at the Great Reconnection with some optimism, I'm just trying to get a sense of the scale of the crisis that you both are feeling, and what sort of optimism you have, or how worried you are, frankly, about whether or not, as people kind of reconnect and their attitudes shift toward their lives as the last year and a half fades away, are they going to come back? Are they going to change their minds? Is that intent to enroll going to come back up? And let's start with Linda on that.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. The crisis is huge. It's notable. Community colleges are feeling it. It will take time for enrollment to get back up, but community colleges, they've been hit before, and they have a commitment to student success. And even though the decline has been great for a lot of colleges, and the average was like 10%, some were beyond 20%, there were very few colleges that their enrollment increased. There are struggles, but we are optimistic that students will eventually return. But we have a role to do. We play a part in that. College leaders have a part to make sure those students come back. And it's about personal connections, contacting those students, those who were disrupted, those who stopped out. But we also don't want to let a good crisis go to waste. We hear that all the time. So what can we do with this crisis? It's about looking at the data. As you really presented the data today, those are conversation starters for us to have with our colleagues, especially at the center. That's what we do. We never say we're in the business of service. We're in the business of conversation starters, especially with food insecurity. Students can't learn if they're hungry or if they don't have a place to sleep. So if we had data like that, we know students are experiencing that, but if we actually knew the percentage of students who were experiencing that because of the COVID pandemic, think about the support services that can be created, that can be structured, that can be redesigned into the student engagement, making sure that they have those boundaries. I mean, we interviewed so many students in our focus groups, and students tell us, a lot of times I just don't know what's being offered. at the college, or what the college is to support my experience there. So it's about communication, letting the students know what's being offered to them. And I'm just going to throw another data point that we learned at the center, just hearing from these students. In our COVID report, we asked students if they knew about the support services to help them cope with the pandemic. You want to take a guess of the percentage of students in this survey that we did that said they didn't know? You know, the actual data point was 57%. 5% of students said no. So to us, we felt that it might be a communication, challenge, because we know colleges are doing everything that they can to really connect to those students, like what was mentioned with the inequities. So if we don't have that data, how can we have those conversations, and how can we make sure students are connected to the appropriate resources to help them move forward?
Thanks for that. Let's turn to Sujin on kind of the scope of the problem we're facing.
Yeah, I mean, I think this crisis looms so large because there are so many folks who stand to miss out on completing a college education. And I think, before the crisis, we had big concerns, and now with the crisis, and it's not just adults who are stranded with some college no degree, but even recent high school graduates who are opting out, the drop in enrollment at the community colleges that Andrew noted, I'm very worried. And I think if we don't act quickly, this historic crisis will only get worse. And, Andrew noted the questions around the value around higher education. And if anything, the data seem to be pretty clear that higher ed pays off. And so, I could share a bunch of statistics on sort of the differences in, earnings between those of the high school graduate and not, and, the types of jobs that people have, and, dependence on public assistance, having health insurance, who gets COVID. I mean, just sort of in every way, we see the differences between, or the value of having a high school or a college degree. The thing that gives me hope is that recent data that, a study that California KP just put out, and Strada put out a national survey also, that found that students want to return to higher education, or want to go to higher education when we look at sort of a two-year span. That we found that 1 in 5 Californians want to enroll in higher education in the next 2 years. And the Strada data, looks similar. And I don't know how much people follow California policy, but we have a historic surplus. The governor's proposal that came out last Friday really targets huge transformative systemic reforms. And so, that's clearly just the first step, and it has to pass, it has to get implemented well. But I do have a lot of hope that there is this energy to do something big and new. And at least in California, we have the funds to do it this year. So, I'm full of hope. And California Repeats, we are working our hardest and our fastest to sort of process these things and to help make connections to the governor's office, to our state legislature, to institutional leaders, to make sure that they're able to act quickly and based on data and research.
Yeah,
go ahead, please.
I'm sorry, Paul, if I can just add to that. I absolutely agree with Sujin. I mean, she mentioned acting. We have to act, because, if we create it, that saying that we build it, they'll come. Yeah, to a certain extent, but what is our role in making sure that we're intentional, with that acting, to connect those students back to us? At one time they came to us, they left, but yet we have to just motivate them to come back, really get to know what they're experiencing. It's really about connection. And so if we aren't intentional in our actions, think about the students that may not return.
To that end, I just wanted to ask Sujin, in the budget discussion in California, if there are any aid reforms in the works or that you'd like to see that would make it easier for adult students to access supports and aid.
Yeah, so I mean, the past 15, 18 months have been a bit of a whirlwind. So in the, let's see, end of 2019, I mean, there has long been recognition that our Cal Grant state financial aid system needs reform. So at the end of 2019, a group of, there was a work group that we participated in that worked together to identify how can we modernize our Cal Grant. That proposal was ready, March 2020, which was not great timing. So as COVID hit, the recession hit, we had a huge, impact on our budget, and that sort of was tabled. Come this year, our state's economy is booming. The sort of I haven't had a chance to dig in on sort of why the huge surplus, but my gut is the rich got richer, and we have a lot more money. And so there are proposals back on the table that look a little bit more robust than even we were thinking in January 2021, to eliminate some of the eligibility requirements that I flagged earlier that we've been pushing on, to get rid of the age requirement, to open up Cal Grants so that adults have more access, to have more what we call competitive Cal Grants, which typically go to older students who are enrolled in career technical education. We're also seeing, and in the governor's proposal, he proposed $1 billion for a grant program for displaced workers to access college or to start businesses. There's also $4 billion for housing. So in California, housing is a real issue, and we have huge issues of homelessness and housing insecurity for students. And this isn't just for the traditional college student, but you can imagine for someone with children, with a partner, a dorm isn't appealing. And for community colleges in California, they rarely have housing, and those that do tend to be the rural institutions that built housing so that students in this sort of wider geographic area have access to the community college. Now there's a growing recognition that we need more college housing, and we need it to serve the students that are wanting to enroll and are enrolled at our institutions. One thing that we applaud the governor for is in his proposals, he's also had a focus on targeting these investments towards the highest need students, which we think will really maximize the resources. So for example, for the housing proposal, the way that the money will be distributed will be based on institutions' share of Pell students, Pell Grant eligible students. So students that enroll more low-income students will get more funding for housing. So we're really excited about that. But there's a number of things. There's also like a learner-aligned employment program to help support more paid internships and paid work-based learning for students, which we think is critical for students, particularly first-generation students who don't have strong professional networks and need that tied to the workplace while they're still enrolled in college. I can go on and on, but I feel like in California, a lot of great stuff that's being proposed. And so we are just hopeful that it gets executed and implemented well.
We'll all be watching that budget process. So I'm going to start turning to audience questions, and one for Andrew, but the other panelists as well, just to kind of dig a little deeper on any significant patterns that you're seeing in the Strada data or elsewhere on disrupted learners and their choices shifting based on demographics or even prior earned credentials.
Well, we reported the age and race differences because that's where we saw the largest differences across the metrics that we analyzed. We always look at gender. We tend to look at age based on generation millennials. Weren't able to get a solid income break in this case necessarily, but that's something else we usually tend to look at. It is the folks with less education, as you might suspect, tend to be those who are pursuing education, who had their education, their learning disrupted. So those are some of the more interesting patterns that we've seen. But we're early on in this broader project of trying to really understand deeply the disruption that's taken place in trying to reach many of these learners. But that's what I'd say what we know so far.
Anything you want to add, either of you there? No pressure. I've got another question to jump to, but just in terms of surprises in the data or who's being most disrupted. No, all right, no problem. So we've got lots to cover. So, I've been watching, as have everybody, the kind of growing interest in non-traditional pathways, shorter term programs, boot camps, short one-year certificates, learn and earn opportunities. This question here, why aren't colleges jumping on this opportunity? I think some are. The reality is that not all jobs need a degree, but all need skills. It seems that colleges are stuck in thinking that degrees are the only way. Anyone want to, let's actually start with Linda. I know you work with a lot of community colleges that are pretty active in the space. Anything you're seeing, any emerging trends?
That's a great question. I really do believe that this pandemic has forced us, has positioned us to start really considering such redesigning our programs, or maybe motivating students to go into certain programs. Like, for instance, we're looking at students, and with other partners that we have, the inequities. Which subpopulations are going into what programs, and how long is it taking, and how much are they spending? And so that's really helping us redesign how we have communications with these students as well. Someone said in the notes right here, higher education, they are so slow to change. But let me tell you, this pandemic has amplified, has put a light on this. And now that we're hearing from students need they come to us, but they need something soon. They can't be there with us for a long time. It's having those conversations, especially when students come to us and they think they're going to attain their goal in 2 years, but they're going part-time. We're like, okay, that's not going to work. So let's make sure you have a plan, that it's crystal clear. Think about these programs. Let's help you redesign it to make sure that you know your entry to completion and how long it's going to take. But those conversations are evolving right now. And I think community college presidents, they're starting to look at that as well. So there's no clear answer for that in short, but the pandemic has made us think about it.
Yeah, tough to generalize about anything in higher education, including short-term programs or alternative pathways to careers. Suchin, though, given the interest there and some of the policy discussions, which we could spend a whole hour on there, what are your thoughts about alternative short-term pathways and how to do them right without tracking folks into credentials that don't have labor market value?
Yeah, I think this is one of those things where it makes so much sense to figure out. And it's, I think, just really challenging too. On the one hand, for many adults, you don't have a ton of time to commit out of to be pulled out of the labor market to get your credential. So you want to be able to do it as quickly as possible. And if that's not possible, you want to be able to keep working while you do it. And so I think the real challenge is around the questions of equity. So how do we ensure that, Black and Latinx students don't end up doing the short-term credentials that have sort of less labor market value or a shorter, lifespan for the labor market, where they'll have to return in 3 years and do another short-term credential, right? And these are things that I think we're still figuring out, like, how do we set that up more intentionally? And it's something that California Competes is working on to figure out, how do we set up equitable career pathways? We're really thinking that we need to really start with the questions of equity in designing versus starting with the career pathway and then try and tweak for equity afterwards. And thinking about some of the other non-traditional learning options, work-based learning, online programs. I was a faculty member for 11 years. And, a lot of this good work has to be driven by faculty. And the really hard part is faculty just have a lot on our plates. So I think like anyone talks about like good leadership, whatever, 80% of your work should be proactive, not reactive. Lots of times faculty just don't have that privilege because we are focused on the courses that we're delivering or the next semester, and plus the burdens, I wouldn't say maybe burdens isn't the right word, but the sort of our work that's beyond the teaching component around shared governance, around helping the institution function. So to think about, I'm going to set up work-based learning, that requires me as a faculty member to now identify who are my employer partners that can offer this. How do I ensure it integrates with the learning outcomes of the program and the course? And then there's additional sort of perhaps requirements like insurance requirements. So now the fact, this is literally something I dealt with in our program, is now I've got to make sure the employer has the right insurance to have interns. And that requires me to then walk their facility. I mean, these are things where it's very easy if you're a faculty member to say like, this is so great, but God, I don't have an extra 5-10 hours this week to go to this site and walk through and then do this with my, however many students in my program. It's a really big commitment that I think institutions, the state has to make, and giving faculty the bandwidth and capacity to do this work if we prioritize it. We can't just say, do work-based learning, here's $1,000 stipend. That doesn't give me time in my day. And so I think there's just complexities, and I think we're getting there to figure it out, frankly. And the same with online programs. Everyone shifted to delivering courses online, but that's, I think everyone is also saying that that's not the same as having this emergency shift to Zoom class is not the same as a good online program. And even prior to COVID, when I taught online hybrid courses, I did my best. But now in this past year, I have seen and learned that what I did was not actually great teaching. Telling my students to go log in and answer 5 discussion prompts to one of their classmates is actually a really bad way to do it. But I frankly did not know. So I think a lot of this is empowering and allowing faculty to have the capacity to lead in instruction and lead around these sort of non-traditional learning options.
Hey, Paul,
Yeah.
if I
Go ahead.
Let's go to Linda and then Andrew.
Sure.
Oh, no, just really short. I think Sujan raised an excellent point about faculty. So when I look at the community college perspective, think about the percentage of faculty who are part-time and who are not involved in these conversations. When we did a report on the guided pathways, over 50% of the faculty said that they were not involved in those conversations of the redesign. And so they also said that they needed support, like professional development, like how do we move this forward? But really that part-time faculty, if they're not involved in the conversations, think about how much more of a struggle it is to change the culture, to make sure those new programs come into place or they're redesigned and shortened, for the student. I'm sorry, Andrew, go.
Just to pull back a little bit, because I recognize, as Dr. Garcia discussed, there is a decent amount of innovation taking place within traditional higher ed. But if we pull back and just think about the entire system, the way we've set up education and training and learning by design is based on a 20th century model of you graduate from high school, you go to school, then you go into the workforce and you learn through working for 40 years. That system is completely obsolete, and traditional higher ed has gotten by, I think, up until the pandemic, sort of based on inertia. But now with the pandemic, all of these forces are kind of coming together. And so, Paul, I think it was a conversation with you last year where you asked me whether we might be at an inflection point with respect to how the entire system works and where people pursue learning. And I think that our data certainly supports that, where it almost doesn't matter if the institutions that don't innovate, that don't come update based on what learners are asking for, they're going to be in real trouble going forward. And there's going to be other people, whether it's employers or non-college providers, who are stepping in and serving these learners. And I think about, there's a short term versus the length of the program piece, but a lot of it that people are asking for, especially if you think about many of these working adult learners who are, someone used the word time poverty recently, and that really captures it well. Like the in-person experience and the need to travel across town for like 2 hours in the day, versus have a, well-designed learning experience that I can pursue at home while balancing all of my competing caregiving family responsibilities. I mean, you can see why that's so desirable on the part of, these working learners. And so we have yet to set up the systems, the architecture, the infrastructure to really build a system that serves working and learning adults well. And there's a huge opportunity there, which is taking us a while to get there.
Speaking of time poverty, I think the pandemic really hit home to folks like me, privileged folks, how hard it is when your life gets disrupted. And I literally cannot imagine, having had a 5-year-old home for a long time, how hard it must be for working parents who are not as privileged. Linda, you mentioned the information gap, how hard it is to get into the hands of learners what they need to do to get where they want to get. We have a couple of questions related to that, and a couple suggest what role could there be for partnerships with employers, with workforce boards, or what role could state and federal policymakers play in helping with career navigation and other information gap closing tools? Linda, anything you're seeing out there that's promising?
That's a great question. So what can employers do? In our role, we look at what community colleges can do, and they're working closely with employers. It's really about setting up those partnerships, connecting programs to employers, like Sujan was saying, and internships, but making sure they're involved in those conversations. But in addition to that, what we've seen at colleges is the intentionality. But when they're doing partnerships now, you have to drill down and really talk to the student and understand what their needs are, but understand what their experiences and their challenges. So colleges are doing something such as having conversations as, what is your life like right now at this moment? Because they're having conversations with the employers as well, because if they're going to place them in internships, they need to know that. Can you balance, your college coursework with an internship? Really looking at the student holistically, not just what their experience is at the college, but to help understand who they are, that person, their struggles.
Sujan, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think the role around work-based learning for employers to introduce, expand internships, externships, apprenticeships, cooperative education. I think that is really, really critical, and make sure that we don't have unpaid internships. Those are, exacerbate issues of equity. Employers can provide tuition assistance or offer free discounted tuition, allow employees to have flexibility in their schedules to attend courses and, do their coursework. We also think about sort of how can we really deeply connect authentic partnerships between higher ed and employers. And one of the really valuable things is employers can provide input on sort of how programs are developed, how are they structured, what is in the curriculum, what are the learning outcomes. And while faculty are experts in that, sometimes we're not super well connected to the labor market, frankly. And I taught in 2 professional programs, which is pretty closely tied, but there are things like, what is like what's data analytics teaching now? Like, what are the current statistical software packages that our graduates should know? That would be really useful. We just recently spoke with leadership at the California Chamber of Commerce. And for example, we have learned that there is a construction management program that required calculus. And so many students did not enroll in that program, or many students did not complete. But the leading sort of employers said that calculus was not a skill that was needed for graduates. And this makes sense clearly in fields where there's a close tie between the program of study and a specific career. But we can't depend on students, I think, to elevate this information, because the students that we're targeting don't necessarily see themselves as belonging in higher ed. And so when they see that, oh, calculus is part of this program, they're not going to reach out to their faculty member and say, like, why is calculus part of this? They'll just think, I'm not college material. I'm not construction management material. So I think this is a really important place where employers can step in, where there's more of a power balance between employers and institutions. But that, clearly takes a lot of work for faculty and employers to do that work. And employers probably don't want to look at college's curriculum, right? So we have to figure out how do we seed and nurture and energize these sort of what we call post-secondary employer compacts. I think it's really critical. One thing that's been happening in California has been trying to connect these disparate systems, the workforce development system and our workforce development boards, our higher ed institutions, particularly community colleges and K-12, but also our social services. So, because many of the students that we're serving can be engaged. What can the American Job Center do for students? Can they help pay for scrubs for nursing students and get rid of some of those barriers? If we know students are low income and qualify for a Cal Grant, is that the same sort of eligibility requirement that would qualify them for our nutrition assistance program, CalWorks? So I think the better we can connect these systems, the better we can do for students. So we really push on how can the state operate better and take the onus off the student to know about the different resources, so that it sort of just naturally happens and the student can focus on the things that we really need them to build, which are their skills to engage in higher ed and not to be sort of a master around eligibility requirements and state programs. So that's what we have been really focused on. And I think employers have a lot of power, so they can really help push some of these conversations because they will hear from their staff or their prospective staff, and higher ed may not, the CalWorks officer may not. So I think that's a critical role for employers.
Linda, I want to give you a chance to respond to some of what Sujin said there, in particular, and go anywhere you want there. But to me, the question of, I get that employers on the whole might not want to get involved in college curricula change, but given the hiring problems that they're complaining about broadly, they need to. And I guess I wonder, from your side of things, are you seeing an inflection point in the way, community colleges have been mindful of employers' needs throughout their history, but is there a shift among faculty in particular to do more? You've got a fast changing economy, so it's not easy to do right now.
Right. So just looking at the state of Texas, there's a Texas Success Center, and they just had their institute. And it was, they focus on transfer, but they also focus on the workforce as well. And so all the colleges in the state of Texas, they brought a team to this institute. And if you're in Texas and you're listening today, I'm sure you can relate to what I'm about to say. So they talked about employers, they looked at their data. Some colleges didn't even know what data do we look at in regards to the labor market. And in fact, once we look at the data, okay, these are programs that we need to establish, need to create. Okay, how do we do that? We need to set up partnerships. What does that mean? We got to create an advisory board, invite those people into the conversation, invite them to the college. In fact, let's also go and visit them. Let's bring them into our classes, maybe in our Zoom classes in this pandemic world, because there needs to be some type of relationship forming. And so let me tell you, it was an eye-opening experience to look at the data, because a lot of the faculty, like Sujin said, they have so many things that they're juggling. And even looking at the data, it was just eye-opening for them because they had never seen it. So it's about involving them, making sure that they feel included, making sure everyone has a say-so into creating these programs. But it has to be intentional. It's about creating the environment. So it's really important for the leaders of community colleges, and I'm sure at 4 years, to set that tone and create an environment that it's inclusive for people to be involved in these conversations.
Well, sadly, we're going to have to wrap it here. I had a feeling this one would go fast, but I have to say you all did a fantastic job of covering a lot of information on these super important topics. So to everybody who attended, thank you. We are going to send around, you'll be receiving a link of a recording from this. And in the meantime, and going forward, I hope you'll check in with the work California Competes and the Center for Community College Student Engagement are doing on these important issues, as well as Strada's continuing push to get good data on what's happening out there. So thanks to you all for joining, and we hope to see you again soon. Cheers.
Thanks for having me.